Okay, and I'm Shlomo Yaffe, and I'm in the process of slowly moving myself into Massachusetts. I work with Chabad at Harvard, uh, and uh, and if I've not outstayed my welcome by getting lost a little bit here too, I hope. Um, and Tonight's topic is on one hand quiet disgust, on the other hand it's extremely scattered. It's a matter of principle, so that everyone be comfortable. That any time I bring texts that are in Hebrew and English. The the ability to translate the scattered references was beyond me. So I will be happy to provide any reference you want, but you will have to take my word for it tonight. Typically, I intend to bring materials where such materials are available in Hebrew and English, or it doesn't take me many, many years to translate them. Um, that's just the. But so we should begin. So the topic is medical care, and I think what I like to do in these kinds of settings is the whole healthcare debate in terms of how healthcare should be provided, how we deal with. There's always limited resources, and right now the way those resources are apportioned has to do with how much money you spend for your insurance policy or how much disposable income you have, which may or may not be good or right. Everything's on the table when we start. And my question to you is, in the context of that debate, even assuming we have the full hour, there are so many issues, and I've prepared a series of them, which I have here in my notes, and I would ask you, what did you come here, besides the general question, what did you come here to hear about the healthcare debate, and which issue in particular?
I
If you,
just think, there's a lot of inequality in this country and like how
Mhm.
healthcare is distributed. So it'd be interesting. But is there any injuries that speaks to having that it's okay to have inequities in healthcare and how healthcare is distributed?
okay, that's
So
it.
is healthcare a responsibility of the community or a need of the individual?
Is it a right?
Can you steal money from some people to give healthcare to others? No.
My. You know, there's uh, there's no conservative like a converted Russian. I realize, I realize that's everyone wonders about it. That's how Ayn Rand got started. She was a teenager under communism. She emigrated to America, and boom. Anyways, but be that as it may. Um, I actually had tickets to her last talk in 1982 in Boston, and she died the day before.
Keep the ticket?
No, no. I was. Everyone had described her to me as the devil incarnate. So I always wanted to meet the devil. But at any rate, but this issue, of course, stuff that Rand and others talk about. The issue of how much responsibility do we have for others. But we should first begin with healthcare, because the approach to healthcare runs the gamut from the concept of a fundamental right, which is what certain European countries have written into their law, African countries too, and so on. We're talking about countries that have the resources to actually actualize that, to the approach that healthcare is a product that you buy like anything else, and where society is not obliged, in other words, government, because we'll start first with government. The government is not obliged to do anything than keep the order and the roads and the military. And if people are hungry, that's charity's job. If people need medical care, so in this country there have been many charitable hospitals. Many of the Catholic hospitals were set up as charitable hospitals. Many of the Jewish hospitals originally were set up as charitable hospitals. You may be familiar. The Shriners hospitals to this day provide orthopedic care for children who are disabled and the like, without any charge, and so on and so forth. So that's one approach. The approach is it's an issue of charity. And the next question is, now that we live in a society where government has apportioned certain social responsibilities, how much should it? So those are the parameters of the debate. I want to take us back, rather than then laying out all the 18 different opinions, maybe 17, but all the 18 different opinions about the issue of healthcare. What I would like to do is develop it from the Judaic point of view, and then you will tell me where you think this leaves us vis-a-vis the debate in our society. I'm going to give you the sources. I'm going to give you what I believe is the vision of Judaic law and ethics on this matter. Then you tell me how we plug it in to the questions we're dealing with now. So step number one we should ask is, God created the world. It's a basic premise in Judaism. And God runs the world. And after all is said and done, the book of Job is about the idea that there are disasters that happen that we can't understand. And, there's earthquakes and volcanoes and tsunamis, and we don't know. Lots of nice people seem to die in them or be injured in them, and we don't know why, and that's one of the great mysteries. And, and this is the great question in religion, all religions. So the first question would be, should one attempt to change the decree of God by dealing in medicine at all? You may know that there are several religious sects in this country, or in Massachusetts actually has a law that prevents them from fulfilling their religion because of a child who died of a bowel obstruction because the mother was, I believe, a Christian Scientist and refused to give them health care because the belief is that prayer alone solves all problems. There are other sects who believe this within various religions. So, if it's God's decree, you have to pray, and either God will listen to your prayer or you'll die. But, I know it's a funny question to ask about a religion that has a higher percentage of physicians as its adherents than any other. But nevertheless, the question is, should we engage in medicine? And the answer is that there's a discussion in Parshat Mishpatim, in Exodus, and the Torah portion we read next week after the Shabbat, which says that if someone injures someone else, you have to pay for X, Y, and Z, and one of the things is, v'rapo yirapeh, you shall surely heal him. In other words, you must pay a physician to heal him, because the word refuah typically means an act of healing. The word refuah means an act of healing done by a agent, in this case, a human agent. So, you shall surely heal means to say, anytime you have a double in the Bible, it means to say that it's something you have to do and you have to make every effort to do so. So if I injure you, I have to pay for your injuries. But this obviously makes it clear that healing things is absolutely not just permitted, but it's mandatory. Because where I'm responsible for your injury, I have to heal you. So we know, obviously, that all rules that apply to someone else apply to yourself. You can't injure someone else. You can't injure yourself. You can't kill someone else. You're not allowed to murder yourself. Suicide is prohibited. So we understand from this that there's a reflexive obligation to heal yourself. So medicine's okay. Next step. What is medicine? And the answer is that medicine is, to a great extent, if we look throughout the Talmud, which discusses the issues of doctors, three issues. There's doctors and their time and expertise. There's medication, and then there's the patient. So in terms of medicine, the practice of medicine, we'll get to medication in a moment. In terms of the practice of medicine, it's very clear, and it's articulated in the Code of Jewish Law, but it is found in the Talmud, that healing someone is a mitzvah. To heal someone, to engage in using your expertise of medicine, is a positive commandment that we derive from Rapo Yirapeh, not just someone you injure, but if you can heal, you must heal. And that obligation applies to Jews and to any, and dealing with the land of Israel in the ancient Jewish Commonwealth, citizenship was conferred by being Jewish. But anyone who was willing to keep basic moral laws that we know as the Noahide laws was allowed to live in society, had the protections of its rights and privileges. And the Talmud lays down that just as you must heal as a doctor, you must heal a Jew, you must heal also a non-Jew who is living in the land under that covenant. So there's an obligation to human beings in general, if you live in a society with the said human beings, to heal them. Says the Talmud, and it's explicit in the Code of Jewish Law, that you may not take money. Now, those who are planning to go to medical school, don't worry. There's a caveat here. You may not take money for healing someone. I may not take money for teaching you Torah tonight, even though it may very well be that there are entities that provide me with a salary for doing this, but I may not take money for teaching you Torah. The reason why there are entities that support me and for teaching Torah, or I raise money to provide me with sustenance in doing so, and all the rabbi stuff, everything Rabbi Chaim does may not be paid for, but the reason that he's alive, though a bit thin, but is because the fact is that there is something called schar batala. We understand that people cannot starve to death, so there is something called schar batala. Schar, the payment, batala of being inactive, which means to say that if I spend time treating you, I could be doing something else, like digging ditches or selling something on TV or playing the stock market. Not so many turns in that right now, but sometimes it's good. Right? There's a whole bunch of different things I could do. And more than that, I have to spend a huge amount of time, and this was true even in the Talmudic era, learning the art of medicine. So I invest all this time and effort in learning the art of medicine. I'm entitled to be paid for my time and effort commensurate with what I would be earning if I had used the same intelligence, expertise, sweat, blood, and tears, and so on in learning something else. So it may even be a very high payment. But your payment is, as is the case of a rabbi, for the fact that you're not doing something else to support yourself, and you invest the time and effort in learning, which somehow needs to be remunerated, especially nowadays with the size of post-medical school loads. So the next thing that happens is that you may say, oh, that's just a subterfuge. It's not a subterfuge. Because since the pay and the art are decoupled, that teaching Torah or practicing medicine is an obligation that you have to each human being. If you know any medicine, you must practice it on that person. You must help that person. So if that's the case, let's say the person doesn't have money. I know that he may owe me the money, she may owe me the money, I'm not going to be paid. You still have to treat the person. Because the mitzvah, the fact you're entitled to money is one thing. The mitzvah, the obligation, is another thing. So now we have a situation where I treated someone, and that person is indigent and doesn't have the money to pay. So the question...
I was just curious. This idea that if you have the ability to heal someone as a doctor, you have a responsibility, is that a uniquely Jewish idea? Or is this something that's found that's broader?
Well, in most states, there is, even the ones that have Good Samaritan laws, as they're called, which comes from a Christian concept. We do not mandate that someone stop and help, but a doctor or a trained EMT or nurse has an obligation to stop and help. On the emergency level, they may not have an obligation to treat someone as a specialist, and so on. Depends on the law. But I think there's a general sense of responsibility to some point, at some level of emergency, in most ethical systems. And I'm sure there are ethical systems, there are religious ethical systems that demand that you treat a person as much as they need, and hope you somehow get paid. I mean, I'm not saying it's unique to Judaism. And in general, I can never answer the unique to Judaism question because I'm not an expert in every religion ethical system. I can say that in Judaism, it is a mitzvah. There is a mitzvah chiyuvit, an absolute obligation, a positive obligation that you cannot escape to save someone's life. So if you're a doctor and have expertise, you have an obligation to do whatever necessary to help them. And that is true even if their life is not in danger, because the commandment, you shall surely heal, applies not just to saving life, but applies to any exercise of the medical arts. So you have to do it. You have a right to ask for money. But if you know that you're unlikely to get paid, you still have to do it. This is only the beginning, yes.
So you have an obligation, but up to what point? Because, you have other things going on in your life, you want to sleep, you want to have a family,
Okay.
You have to do an obligation to provide care.
24/7. So that's an excellent question. We actually just dealt with that at the Harvard Medical School. The very last session we did last semester. We talked about this issue, the balance of life, because, a lot of the people already, they see how intense it is. And basically, I won't dwell on it a long time, but basically there's a rule you're allowed to break the Shabbat, you're allowed to break the Sabbath in order to engage in medical care to save someone's life. So the general consensus in most authorities is that that you are allowed to return home also, even if that involves breaking the Shabbat, because the argument is that if that not only will you not be available from your home base if someone else needs help that day, but if you do not return, you do not go home, and ultimately will become such a burden on you that your desire to engage in medicine or to be on call on Shabbat and so on will be negated. And because the Shabbat can be broken, if there's any chance someone's life will be broken, the drain on your psyche will ultimately probably damage someone. So you must break the Shabbat to avoid the drain on your psyche. If you become a doctor, ask your local rabbi. There's a lot of details to this. But Reb Moshe Feinstein, who was one of the classic halachic authorities and a very mainstream Orthodox kind of fellow, was quite emphatic about that for this reason. So my point is that, I mean, if there's a hurricane, if there's a plane crash, if there's a terrorist attack, you're going to work 24/7, etc. But where there's a whole system, as we have, clearly you want to be in the position where you are most effective. There's a curve. There's a point of involvement at which you save the most lives, help the most people. And then there's a curve, and the curve isn't just today, it's over time. So if your family life is shot and you become burnt out, as the term goes, what happens is that in the long term, over your 40 years that you can, for 50 years you can practice medicine, you're not going to do it properly. And that's the same reason why we don't want to set up a system where everyone gets treated. And exactly this segues me into the next point, that we cannot have a system in which everyone gets treated and a lot of people don't pay, because then no one's going to want to be a physician. And by the way, this is a separate topic which we can address more aggressively another time, but malpractice is limited under Jewish law. It's explicit in the Code of Jewish law, and the concern is because if you give the patient the full right to sue, doctors will not want to be doctors, which is something what's happening now with the increase of the cost of malpractice insurance premiums. In Connecticut, obstetricians and even anesthesiologists are leaving the profession at a very rapid rate, at a rate above replacement, and it's a serious problem. So you don't want a situation, which brings us to the next question, which is who should pay. In other words, I must treat, and I must treat effectively, and it's not just to save a life. It's even, as you asked, further down the road of the process of treatment. I must do what I can for the person, again, within the parameters, but there's a difference between getting burnt out because I'm spending too much time, which, as we said, can be dealt with, and the issue of not getting paid, at which point I'm not going to want to be a physician at all, and I'm going to resent being a physician, and resenting having to be there is a very, very dangerous thing for your patients. And more than that, how am I supposed to survive? If I'm a doctor, I need to be able to survive. You know, it's all nice to say that I'm entitled to money, but if I don't get it, we have a problem. And this brings us to the statement when the Talmud discusses the fact that one must treat the resident alien just like the Jew. It says that we feed them, we give them charity, and we heal them for free. Now, the commentaries say that means we heal them for free as necessary, that a Jew or someone who is part of your community, who may not be Jewish, you have an obligation to heal them for free. What does that mean? That means that if they do not have money, that the community is responsible to heal them. Again, we have the doctor obviously needs to be paid because the doctor needs to survive. And typically speaking, the model that various responsa use from very early on, we're talking from the medieval period on, and perhaps earlier, but it's only hinted in the Talmud, that medical care is like food. So let's talk about food in society. Typically speaking, I need to work, make money, and buy food for myself and my family. If I do not have sufficient money, we're told that a person should push themselves, make every effort possible not to take charity, but if you're starving, you should take charity. So too with medicine. Medicine should be paid for. And I would argue, by the way, that two things. One is that the idea of paying a doctor for his work helps keep costs down because everyone's paying. In other words, people should pay out of pocket. Now, with regards to modern medicine, I would argue that everyone is poor. Unless you're a multi-millionaire, with regard to the cost of treatment for heart disease, for cancer, for a complicated orthopedic operation, plastic surgery for burns, etc., the costs are astronomical. So at a certain point, everyone's poor. Now, one of the ways to deal with that is insurance. The Talmud actually says that people used to travel in these caravans of boats, that used to go down rivers, that you can stop someone, that everyone is obliged to buy insurance. Everyone puts money into, the insurance is everyone puts money into a pot, so if someone loses their boat, everyone chips in and buys a boat for them. But that all the members can force each other to pay for this insurance. The person can't say, I'm going to risk it, because he ends up endangering everyone. So Massachusetts law that everyone should have insurance is like the boats. You, by endangering everyone, by not having insurance, not being able to pay, you put a strain on everyone, you put a strain on the system. So it's perfectly, first of all, I would suggest, since everyone is poor via medicine, that mandating that people buy insurance is absolutely within the vision of Jewish law. Again, this particular case with the boats indicates that we should demand. That's first. Secondly, that people who don't have the money to afford their medical care or insurance, don't have money for insurance, that like food, we're obliged to provide it. If someone genuinely can't afford to eat, we are obliged to provide them with food. We're obliged to provide them with medical care. However, again, I think everyone should pay, and I would say that the Talmud and particular later Jewish law would prefer that everyone pay point of service. That everyone pay up to a point, it's the idea like the medical savings accounts that we have in this country, some corporations do. Everyone pays out of pocket, that keeps costs down, that creates a relationship, a responsibility, and then when we reach the point that you can't pay, either you have insurance or someone buys insurance for you. In Jewish law, there's no such thing as private charity, public charity. In other words, charity is tzedakah, which means justice. Everyone has to contribute to charity based on their income, and the community under Jewish law can force you to pay. It's really like a tax. Charity is justice. You have money, and you have more than you need. You have to share it. There is a degree. Tzedakah is a form of redistribution. It's a dirty word for some people here, but it's a form of redistribution. And Meir Tamari, who was the governor of the Bank of Israel and a great Talmudic scholar, he says,
When was that?
he's still around, but he was governor of Bank of Israel, I think, in the early 80s. But Meir Tamari, as far as I know, he's still alive. Meir Tamari says that the Jewish vision, the Jewish economic vision, the Talmudic vision, is that we acquire wealth by unabashed capitalist means, and we share it and redistribute it to attain socialist goals. Which means to say that we want a healthy, competitive, open market economy, but that we create a floor of basic needs that no one falls below. We create a floor of basic food, shelter, actually the four rights that Roosevelt was working on before he died, that everyone's entitled to food, shelter, education, and medical care. And that indeed is the Judaic view. And
Those four?
yeah, we have to educate the poor of the city. We have to pay for them. We have to feed. We have to provide shelter for people who live in the city. There's a residence requirement, just like in Massachusetts or anywhere else. Right? And what else? When medical care is like food, as we established. So the model would be, under Jewish law, and that people should pay for their medical care. The Talmud makes a statement that asva magana, asva Aramaic, asva a healer, magana who charges nothing, magana shavia is worth nothing. And has anyone here had experience with socialized medicine? I lived in England for several years. You are literally a number. I have a friend who has some very severe liver problems. Here, within a week or two, you'd see a specialist, because the person is, as I was once told by the secretary at my local NHS office, that unless you have blood pouring out of both ends, don't expect to be moved up the line. Because the reality is there's no real incentive to devote yourself entirely to a patient. Where a patient's a customer and your income is dependent upon treating patients well, and your income and prestige is dependent on your relationship with your patients, you're going to treat them better. So everyone should pay. At a certain point, we're all poverty-stricken, so to avoid that, we should be obliged to buy insurance. If we can't afford it, someone should pay for it. Now, the next issue is allocation of scarce resources, because there are treatments that are always going to be cutting edge, very expensive, and need to be allocated properly. Allocation of scarce resources runs in the following way. There's a discussion about this in Israel in the 70s when dialysis machines were very rare and very expensive relatively. But if someone is already on dialysis, you cannot take them off it. You cannot, because they already have the treatment. But we can triage and say this person is likely to live a longer time and have more quality of life than this person. Since there's only 10 slots and there's 30 people who need it, before you put someone in the treatment plan, you can choose the 10 most likely to benefit.
This was in Israel, you're saying?
Yeah, well, I don't, maybe still be, but I think that dialysis is not such an impossible thing now in Israel.
I was saying, because I guess that's not how we do it here.
No, because there's more money and machines are cheaper and.
Well, I was just saying, the way it's done is not based on any cost benefit. Like this person's more worthy.
Well, in this country,
Yeah,
in this
right.
country, we have unlimited, not unlimited. We have very high level of resources, and we pay for it.
Right, but I'm saying you were just going to.
I'm saying no, go ahead, please.
Well, the point is for let's say not dialysis, but like a transplant or something.
Yeah, there's a list.
Right, but just based on your number, when you sign up for the list.
But there are people who don't get on the list.
Right.
We discussed this at HMS. There are people who don't get on the list.
If you're a 50-year-old and you're a 70-year-old, the 70-year-old can still get it even if they have.
That is true. Jewish law would actually be more interventionist. It would say that until you actually have the patient in front of you, if you're choosing between lists, the list should go by viability. However, once the concept is called lifanenu.
Viability as what?
In other words, if I have two people...
Viability of success or viability of productivity, viability of longer life?
Basically, the longest, healthiest life. In other words, if I have a 40-year-old and a 60-year-old, where I only have one heart, I can give the 40-year-old preference, provided they're both before me at the same time. In other words, if a 70-year-old shows up in the hospital for a transplant and you open him up, and you're already in the process, right, and then a 40-year-old is brought in with a heart attack, a complete, utterly, God forbid, destroying his heart, you're not going to stop and say, okay, sew him up and we'll give the heart to the 40-year-old. Because lifanenu, he is before us. So once someone is on the... And by the way, this is how the Israeli rabbinate suggests medics behave in battle, that they do triage in the traditional way. In battle, and in the military has more options. Because you sort of give your life over to the military when you sign up. So even the American military, they do triage on the battlefield, and we do triage at a accident scene also. But the point is, you can do triage. There are many modern responses from Israel that say that before we have people in front of us where it's a choice between 10 people, we choose the most valuable.
What is this based on? What?
The idea that ein docha nefesh b'pnei nefesh, the idea that you don't push away one life before another, which is written in the Talmud, only applies, according to the early commentators in the Talmud and certainly subsequent ones, lifanenu, when the person is before us, but not where the person is. So if he's here, you got to treat him or her. Where they're not before us, then you don't have to.
I don't want to belabor the point, but so if somebody's 35 and somebody's 75 and the 35-year-old person is somebody who's been in and out of jail, he's seen as wicked, and the other person's of the...
That's actually not your judgment to make.
Who's qualified to make that
But the judgment
analysis?
is, though, that this person has a better likelihood of having a healthy, long life.
Right, it goes by...
Maybe not as fulfilling in the traditional sense.
Right, it goes by health.
Where's that from that it goes by health?
Oh, because basically the Chuvas talk about this idea that you go by where the medical treatment has the greatest likelihood of success.
Where the truth is getting them from?
They're getting it from the idea that you can be docha one nefesh before the other, where they're not both in front of us. Where you have to choose between one or the other, where you have to choose, you can choose the person who the medical intervention is most likely to help.
Who's qualified to make that
But
decision?
they're going to help
Medicine.
They're going to
Medical.
help them. They're going to help them both, but they're going to help them both. The question is, how long will it last?
Exactly, and
But
that's the definition of helping. That's the definition of helping. In other words, that was the discussion about dialysis. Is that are there perhaps alternative opinions? I don't know. I only know what I've researched. But it's now. Now there is. You should know, since you brought it up, that there is a class of wicked person who were not obliged to make efforts to save. Like someone who's a recidivist who's committed violent crimes more than 3 times and so on, we don't have to make special efforts to save them. But someone, who's in for their first tax evasion or shoplifting or something, and you have some ancient rabbi who may or may not make it, and the young shoplifter who will, you go with the young shoplifter. That's the reality. Now,
And someone on death row.
someone on death row is
Consider them like dead already.
They're dead already.
Pretty
with regards to certain things. With someone who what?
Get pardoned at like the last
What?
second, then it might as well be done.
I'm sorry?
All of these issues were on like a medical show, Grey's Anatomy, this last week.
Right. So if someone is on
That's
death,
not a problem.
no, if someone's condemned to death, well, obviously we're not going to do anything to save their life. That's a separate story. More than that, someone already condemned to death at the hands of the court, you may not be first-degree murder, or whatever the highest degree is. It may not be the highest degree of murder if you kill them, but not that it's right, but it may not be in itself actionable with a death penalty, which is different from American law. But that's subject for law. Let's get back to the issue of medicine. So there is an issue of where there where resources are not available. So the resources should be apportioned according to where the medical treatment should be most effective, unless we have the person in front of us. We never push someone away, even if they're very old and frail, because someone may show up later.
Though that's inevitable.
Right, but that's the idea of lefanenu, because someone may show up. In other words, as long as the person is a statistic. Now, statistics are real. Maimonides discusses statistics. In other words, statistics are real in the sense that it's inevitable that a 40-year-old with a heart attack will show up. But the statistics do not have halachic weight until you actually have a person who emerges from the cloud of statistics.
But it actually goes by who would be on that list first, right? And then you would go, if you were at the same time, then you would go by like likelihood of success.
Right.
But at first it goes by whoever.
So that is a question that actually we've been thinking about. That is a question as to whether putting someone on a list constitutes already having them before us. Because they're all before us. In other words, having someone before you, and once you start treating someone, that person's before you and the other younger person is not. Where it's just about a list, they're all before us and not before us. So you may not follow strict precedents. You may not. It could very well be, and I believe the law would be you would not follow strict precedents, because they're not before us until we actually have an organ. And there is some discussion about this. In one of the Talpiot, which is an Israeli journal that deals with contemporary issues, there's a discussion as to how you define before you in a modern world, where you have people beginning to come down with symptoms, you have people who haven't come yet, you have people who have got into the system but haven't yet been identified as transplant candidates. This is a subject that I will unabashedly tell you that inasmuch as there's huge discussion and argument, I do not know exactly how that would play out in Jewish law, at what point you move from being a possibility to actually a patient. But I'm pretty sure that the person would have to be in some stage of preoperative preparation to be considered before us. So taking those things together, it would seem that ability to pay should not be part of the issue of the triage. It should not be part of the issue of defining who gets what's medical care. And that's another aspect. I have two of you in front of me. One I know can pay, one I know is unlikely to pay, so the community will have to kick in. I have an equal mitzvah to treat both of them. I cannot allow ability to pay to sway me in who I treat. and it goes simply by all the rules that we lay out. So ability to pay should not change your access to medical care, because you could change your access to a nicer clinic and having a private bed. And dealing with the NHS, still have 20, 30 people in a single ward and all that. Like in America, you see it only like the old movies from the 1920s, but in England, in many places, it's still the case. There's certainly rooms with large numbers of beds. You want a private room. You want extra nursing help. You want good hospital food. Those things we're not entitled to provide you with. But the basic question of medical care should not be defined by money, because it's a mitzvah related to like feeding someone and so on. I'm obliged to feed you. I may not be obliged to give you good tasting food. I'm obliged to provide you with nutritious food. And there's actually discussion about that the food needs to be that the charity provides needs to be nutritious as well as sufficient. And the Talmud defines that quite precisely.
My question is probably beyond the scope of just medicine, but if let's say you want to be a plastic surgeon, I mean, the utility of that is probably less than being like a general internist or some other specialty that's like more needed by everybody. So do you have an obligation to pick a more useful field than something that because if you're a plastic surgeon, you really treat the wealthy who can
First of all, plastic surgeons do a lot of work with burn victims.
But if
with
you
cleft
decide
palate.
you want to do you're going to do nose jobs or
The answer is, I think I actually have a member of my synagogue, a young man who I had this discussion with, and I told him if that's the kind of work you're going to do, it's really a waste of an ability and of a talent and so on. I think if we had a Sanhedrin, the Judaic court system, I could legally order someone not to be a plastic surgeon. I like it. I would think that but many things in law are not actionable in a court, but Jewish law ethics is after all your personal business. There are lots of things that you're ethically obliged to do that there's no legal penalty for speaking ill of someone, but slandering people is really, really bad. But there are no legal penalties, other than where you hurt someone's business or you insult someone to their face and so on. But, gossiping about people is a very bad thing, as you probably know. Deleterious gossip, as you know from Jewish law. There's no action, but it's clearly something we need to avoid. So the same thing here. However, I would tell you there's no prohibition against it, and a lot of plastic surgeons I know do both things. And several of them, the ones I know in Hartford, and they travel to countries where they do cosmetic surgery on very poor people. And you should know, by the way, that the question was raised whether you could have complex plastic surgery to correct some deformity of the face and the like, because there's a danger, and you're not allowed to put your life in danger. And the answer is that if a person has bad self-image and is psychologically debilitated and feels bad about themselves and because of the way they look, that healing someone's psyche is a legitimate reason to engage in a certain level of risk. So my point is that where you're fixing the way people look, where there are serious problems, not frivolous things, and you're restoring to them a sense of dignity, a sense of dignity, a sense of self-worth and so on. Those things are absolutely equal, because psychological healing, mental healing.
Objective, no.
Right.
I mean, somebody's 70 years old and feels bad and they want Botox.
No, we're not. We're talking about where someone feels uncomfortable. Society feels uncomfortable developing.
Like Siamese twins and something of.
No, they don't feel they can go out with anyone. They don't feel they can get married. They don't, all those things.
Or like a burn victim whose face is completely different.
Yeah, but even someone, some people are born, with just misshapen, or badly shaped faces,
But aren't we taught that our body is on loan from God and we should be happy with what we have to begin with? And
but that goes back to the medicine. Should I heal myself? My body's on loan for God. I have a big abscess. There's like a baseball bat. It's God maybe he was susceptible to that abscess.
Well, yeah.
You shouldn't treat acne because everyone gets acne at a certain point in their life, right? You know what I mean? What you don't do to your body is damage it or harm it, but improving it in a way that deals with serious, legitimate psychological senses of self-worth and the like is a genuine fixing, just as fixing, just as braces are.
Fair enough.
So
By the way, that's why the question is raised, since it's a mutilation to get an earring, because you make a hole in the ear, and the answer is it's very interesting. My father-in-law actually was a rabbinic judge in New York. He actually found a responsa that addresses the issue and says that since the pain is momentary and the mutilation is very small, and the pleasure that people get from wearing earrings and their sense of happiness is significant, and there's no real danger, that's not considered mutilation or damage to the body.
But the same can be said about the tattoo.
What?
The same can be said about a tattoo.
About what?
A tattoo. You could extend
Tattoo has nothing to do. The reason, the prohibition against the tattoo, contrary to popular opinion, has nothing to do with the fact that your body's unload for God. The prohibition against smoking has to do with the fact your body's unload for God. And I will posit here, even though some of my colleagues don't agree with me, that there is an absolute halachic, based on what we know, there's an absolute halachic prohibition against smoking. You take it to the bank. What?
Cracking joints.
What?
What about cracking joints?
cracking your joints.
And
It
damaging
turns
to
out
your liver, like-
turns out that cracking joints is not as dangerous as people thought it was. It doesn't necessarily give you arthritis at an older age. But at any rate, the point is that the tattoo is because it's a chok, it's a mitzvah without a particular reason. Maimonides takes a stab at the reason that it has to do with idolatry, because it used to be they tattooed slaves. That's why concentration camp fixed got tattooed, so they couldn't run away. Then people said, "Oh, I'm a slave to Zeus or to whichever the idol was," and tattooed themselves with an image of the god. And because it has such deep idolatrous roots, and we're told to avoid idolatrous ideas, so that may be the reason for not having a tattoo. But it's not about mutilation. I mean, many people would argue it makes them look better, I don't see why a big anchor, on your forearm makes you look better, but, to each their own. It's not for me to argue.
If drinking is damaging to your brain and your liver, then why are we...
The answer is drinking in moderation is not damaging at all, and therefore Kiddush wine, a l'chaim on Shabbos, and, even a glass of wine after dinner every night are all good for your health and not bad for your health. Drinking has one of those, there's a name for it, any mathematician, there's a curve that goes up gradually, reaches a point, and then sharply goes down.
So would it be...
What? It's one of these things where the benefit for drinking goes up gradually. Reach a point that at a certain amount, I think like between 5 and 8 drinks a week, there's a very high positive benefit. Then if you go over the 8 drinks a week, you get a very, very quick negative correlation. It's one of these weird shaped curves. There's a name for it. It escapes me. So you should drink.
Could you make that argument for marijuana too, though?
I don't... on 2 levels you can't. I mean, we should have a separate discussion. Very briefly, on 2 levels you can't make that argument. One, because the law of the land is the law with regards to such things, because it's not endangering your life not to smoke it. And it's questionable whether there is any, to someone who is not sick with glaucoma or pain from cancer or so on, there's very little evidence, or perhaps no evidence would be correct to say, that a small amount of marijuana is beneficial to you. But a small amount of alcohol, about a drink, or a little bit more, about 1 drink a day, especially, red wine best, but even beer or vodka, etc., 1 small drink a day is absolutely beneficial and far more beneficial than not drinking. In other words, not drinking is bad for you. Drinking a little bit is good for you, but drinking a lot is worse than not drinking at all. So it's this.
It's a weird curve.
Yeah.
Response curve.
There, all the way down there. Yeah. So. Yes, your question.
So, what are the specific cases where, you wouldn't be obligated to treat someone?
Okay, so that's it's not if they don't have money, obviously.
Right.
However, there are cases that, for example, there's a discussion that if someone sells themselves into slavery to non-Jews, that you have to redeem them. But once they've done it twice, you don't have to redeem them anymore because they're making their own problems. In other words, I would suggest that there may be a level of self-injury where you would not be obliged where someone lifestyle issues. There was a big issue with Mickey Mantle many years back, getting a liver transplant because he was a very bad drinker. And a lot of ethicists says that he shouldn't be given. In other words, we said before that with a transplant you go by who's before you. But if the person deliberately abuses their health, that law, because redeeming captives is considered saving life, but that law would indicate that you would give precedence to another person who may not be in front of you.
But ultimately,
Right.
your instinct should always be to help.
The instinct should always be to help, but people who injure themselves, that goes into the equation. But the instinct should always be to help. It's the same thing like a person who's hungry because they spent all their money gambling or on drink. Your obligation is to feed the hungry. That's your obligation, to do so in an effective way. Now, we may not want to make it comfortable for the person who ruins their own life. We may want to give them vouchers for food and not money. We may want to supervise them, and so on and so forth. We may want to say, here's a plate of food, eat it here, because I don't want you trading it for kelp or something. But the fact is that we are obliged to help everyone that we can. Where there's a question of triage, where someone is self-injuring, the lung transplant for the smoker would go, and again they're responsible about this, would go to a further down the bottom of the list. But in cases where the person we know is harming themselves, we still have to feed them, because your obligation is predicated on the fact that you must help, not on whether the person is deserving of it or not.
And that they're standing before you.
Yeah, but I'm
And they're
saying
like-
where it's a question of like someone who harms themselves and shows up in the emergency room, where people are drugs, alcohol, whatever, you still have to help them. However, Jewish law doesn't give you the right to harm yourself. One of the big issues now in mental health is that in the reforms of the 1970s caused a lot of very mentally ill people to be released onto the street because advocates says since they can define their wishes, they shouldn't be held. Something like 80% of the homeless in, say, New York City are people with mental or severe substance abuse issues. Jewish law absolutely says that we have the right to intervene to help you. So if you have a substance abuse issue, we can imprison you till you dry out. We can stop you from harming yourself. The greatest obligation is to stop someone from harming themselves. So we can take whatever forceful intervention is necessary to stop you from harming yourself.
Where do you draw that line?
I was waiting for that question. That is a excellent question that I would suggest you draw. I think you would draw the line where there's a direct, not immediate, but there's a very strong linkage. And what exactly is a strong linkage? I think that's something that needs to be dealt with in each time and place according to its society. In other words, the person who smokes a few cigarettes raises their danger, but clearly they're not creating immediate danger. The person who has a fragile liver and kidneys and is drinking a bottle of rot gut wine, every day, that person we should intervene, because that person's on a path that is definitely going to destroy them, not that increases the risk. I think that, and where do you draw the line between a risk and definite destruction? One possible answer is one possible answer based on the laws of kashrut and which animals are considered to be too ill to eat, and because there are ramifications to this in death penalty law in other areas, someone who's a treifa, someone whose treifa means literally torn, someone whose behavior would lead them to destruction within a year. But that may not be the only parameter. In other words, and I think that this we have to come to social consensus between ethicists, religious leaders. If someone was asking Jewish law, we'd sit and talk with the doctors and try to arrive at some kind of consensus. But the idea is there should be a direct linkage, not a heightened risk. Lots of drink, lots of drugs, direct linkage between the behavior and death rather than a heightened risk. One of the proofs of this, as I can tell you, is you're not allowed to kill someone for mercy killing. You're not allowed to give someone enough morphine to kill them because they're suffering. But you can give them morphine that will reduce their heart rate and will ultimately cause them to die quicker, as long as there's not a direct linkage. In other words, the morphine itself is not the only cause of death. So I would suggest the same thing applies here.
Morphine and time?
What?
A
combination of morphine and time and the fundamental underlying disease.
I thought Judaism didn't believe in euthanasia.
No, it doesn't believe euthanasia, but allaying someone's pain will reduce their life, let's say by a month, by a week, because the heart rate is reduced and and of course, without the reduction of heart rate and respiration debilitates the body further. We're dealing with people already very debilitated, God forbid, by cancer and the like, and so on. So that's so you don't, now exactly where to draw the direct linkage. That's a very interesting question. But I think this idea of the year and this idea of direct rather than multifactorial would figure in. And again, there are indications to this. This particular question has probably been dealt with. I have not come across it. And one of the most important obligations a rabbi has is that if his fathers tell us that when you come across something you don't know, you should say, I don't know. So I don't know exactly.
Kind of bring us back to your original question, kind of. Are there any examples you can think of today where Jewish medical ethics are in opposition to contemporary medical practice?
Well, one of it might be the transplant list.
Transplants.
Another area is the consent idea that people have the ability to walk out and not take medical care in states other than Massachusetts, not give medical care to children. Someone not taking medical care will kill them. If they say I don't want to go through the suffering, there's a lot of suffering, in let's say a cancer treatment that may or may not help. So then you have the right to say that.
Or do not
You have the
resuscitate.
DNR.
Yeah,
I
DNR.
actually just dealt with this question. You have there are rights for DNR. I mean, this is a separate question, really. It's the medical ethics side rather than the healthcare issue. But the DNR is certainly a permissible thing under certain circumstances, where the suffering would be very great and the long-term prognosis not any better.
DNR is what?
Do not resuscitate, where someone, don't compress their chest and all that if the heart fails because they're frail and have other problems. However, where someone simply refuses medical treatment, maybe because they're mentally ill, or for whatever the reason is, and that medical treatment would save their life, or have a very good chance of saving their life, and they refuse it, under Jewish law, we should probably force the person to take the medical care. And certainly where it's dealing with a child who's a minor, we should not give the... By the way, parents don't have right to harm their children, only to help them. In other words, you have no rights over your child to say, I won't treat the child, because of some, belief or fear or concern that you have.
So you don't either have a right as a parent to let out your steam on your child by beating them.
That goes without saying. But we're talking... Well, it goes without saying. But we're talking about that you don't have the right to refuse medical treatment for your child for whatever the reason is.
Are you obligated to give immunization shots?
Absolutely, and this is the question Rabbanim have been asked. Halachic deciders have been asked about this, and the answer is we go with the halacha goes with the consensus of Bikiyim, of medical experts in a given field. The consensus is that childhood shots do not cause autism.
There was just a court ruling on this today.
Oh, and what did the court say?
That it doesn't cause autism.
Okay, because there was already medical research recently, a very highly published research, publicized research. But
3 cases were ruled today.
where, Massachusetts?
No, it's a national thing.
One of the courts or state
It was
court?
a special court that was set up for this.
In one of the circuits or
I don't recall them saying.
Okay, but the answer is that under Jewish law we absolutely would force parents to give the children immunizations because you endanger the health
But if there is
of the whole community. You know why?
Huh?
You know why? Because if you have a group of people who catch measles, that you create a pool of resistant bacteria that can then affect those who've already been immunized.
It's not because we care about the child.
We care about the child. Oh.
There's
No, because the point is that if everyone else is immunized, you could argue that the child is unlikely to catch anything because everyone else is immunized. But my point is that if we say that you create a pool, then not only the children get affected, will affect others. In other words, it's like the story with the wine in Chelm. Chelm was this town of very foolish people, by tradition, and because actually there were 2 towns, Kelm and Chelmno, who both had a lot of scholars. But there's a made-up town called Chelm, the wise men of Chelm. So one day, they were very poor, obviously, and one day they decided, there's never any wine to celebrate a wedding. They have a few weddings a year, it's a small town. So they said, every Shabbos, everyone gets a little bit of wine for Kiddush, and according to Jewish law, you're allowed to add a bit of water. So everyone should add a thimbleful of water, and take a thimbleful of the wine, and pour it into a barrel they set up in the middle of the town square. So about 6 months go by, and it's time to celebrate the first wedding, and the barrel looks pretty full. So they take a jug to fill it up for the wedding, And they open the spigot, and lo and behold, out rushes beautiful clear water, because everyone figured that they could be the one to put in a thimbleful of water, and no one would know the difference.
It's the tragedy of the commons.
What?
It's like a tragedy of the commons. I think it's an economic term.
Yeah. That anything that is common isn't taken care of. You saw this in Soviet Russia, that on the communal farms, 2% of the land was given over for people like private plots, officially, the kitchen gardens. But that 2% of the land that was farmed privately produced something like 30% of the actual produce. Once you took into account the fact that people were hiding it and selling it on the black market and so on. So
No, it's called the free rider problem. That's like more specifically about that. That if everybody's asked to give a little, but like anonymously, then nobody will give anything.
well, yeah, I mean, it's an intersection of economics and psychology. But
Yeah,
we
that's like the distribution of blame thing too. Like if like with Kitty Genovese, that woman who was stabbed.
and a lot of people saw her being
but
stabbed.
everyone thought someone else would call the cops, so no one did it.
Right.
She died. That kind of thing. It's like a sociological thing.
Right. Yeah. But all these things come together.
Right.
But at any rate, the point is that you can't be the only one, because not only endangering your children, you're endangering the community, and we simply don't give account. We don't give weight in these halachic questions to an opinion that is not accepted by experts. Expert opinion may change, but halacha says Jewish law says we only have what's before us, and therefore we can only go by what the consensus of expert opinion is. Where expert opinion is split, then individuals have the right to follow expert opinion. And by the same token, if there are broadly accepted alternative medicine, for example, in New York State, in New York in general, chiropractic is very accepted. And I can attest that chiropractors are good with certain kinds of back and joint problems. So someone who wants to use a chiropractor is entitled, rather than an orthopedist, is entitled to do so for certain kinds of things. But someone who has a chiropractor says they can cure cancer, which there are such, Jewish law would not recommend this alternative therapy because there's really no evidence that it's helpful.
What
Yes.
about a parent giving their child an organ that, by
You mean like a
giving-
kidney?
or a heart or something? Like
Well, the parent to give,
something that would kill the parent
No.
to give to their
No,
child.
your first obligation is to your life. You can risk your life for another person, but you cannot kill someone
Even
for
if,
another person.
even if it's your child, like if they need.
Your child is still, God made you and your child, someone else. Your obligation is still to you before to your
But
child.
you could give other organs that wouldn't.
You could give a
life.
kidney.
Yeah.
You give a kidney to a stranger too. I mean, there's halachic rulings about this. You're not obliged to, but you could.
Can we summarize?
Okay, so I think...
No, we could stay here all night, but just...
I know, and I have to go anyway. They used to be coming a little bit late, but not too late. Hopefully we'll get lost on the way there. The conclusion...
But in 2 weeks we're going to be meeting again, and this time Rabbi knows the way, or we'll...
Yeah. Well, I'll have my new GPS by then, or I'll have or I'll call,
We'll
I'll
set
make
up-
a good map, whatever. No, I'll get
No,
a
we'll send out a
GPS.
pool. We'll send out an email. Make a
Right.
call.
No problem. But let me just. I think I would summarize by saying that the ideal system from the point of Jewish law would be, irrespective of the medical ethics issues that clearly our group was so interested in that you raised, would be that we should not have an HMO health insurance purely system. That people should pay point of service up to a certain level that we determine is viable for people. In other words, the idea of a health savings account that we establish up to what amount people can typically reserve, depending on your income for health. After that, people should be obliged to buy insurance because they strain the whole system and the whole community by not doing so. If they cannot afford that insurance, it is the obligation of the community, the city, the state, the federal government, the New World Order, whatever, to provide them with insurance. And someone who's so poor they can't afford anything at all, clearly it's like food, it follows under the obligation, you shall surely heal, and we can't leave the doctors in the lurch, so the government, the community, has to pick up the tab. It's picked up by tzedakah, righteousness, which is essentially a form of taxation, because you must give charity. You don't have a choice under Jewish law.
Wait, how does tzedakah work? Like, how does this work? I mean, nowadays we... Like,
How does tzedakah work in the community as defined in halacha?
yeah.
As defined in halacha, the way it works, if you look, it's very beautifully laid out in Maimonides, that we assess that the standard thing is that people should give 10% of their post-tax, post-interest income. But in communities that have bigger needs and smaller pockets, they can take more than 10%. In other words, where it's voluntary, where there's no one poor in the community, where you live in a society like ours where welfare is not handled by the community, by the Jewish community, so then you give 10% of post-tax, post-interest income. In a classic Jewish community, people are assessed. We try to keep it at 10%. But if 10% doesn't cover it, we'll assess wealthy people more and poorer people less on a sliding scale. And that money goes for two things. That money goes to provide food for people at 30 days, clothing and shelter after 6 months, money for food, and medical care and a soup kitchen immediately for people who need it. The soup kitchen used to be run at a time when basically everyone kept kosher by collecting food from every household. You made supper, you made extra, and it was collected. It's called tamchoy, the communal plate. But where the tamchoy is not practicable, the charity funds pay for the soup kitchen. Medical care is like the soup kitchen. We need it right away. And you'd have to, and that would be provided by assessing people's incomes and assets on the basis.
Who does all the distribution?
What?
Who does all the distribution?
The Beit Din appoints uninterested parties of impeccable moral character who do it together, so they don't suspect you of stealing. Let me give you the basic idea. You want to talk about taxation very briefly, and before I go, Shmuel's father was a tax collector. The government in Babylon, in the Sassanid Empire, gave the Jews autonomy to collect the taxes. So, and those taxes depended on their needs. So it used to be the tax collector was like minting money. You squeezed the people for what you could get. You gave the government as little as you could convince them to take. You kept the rest. So Shmuel did the first part. He collected the money and he squeezed the government. Then he took the surplus and gave it back to everyone in proportion to what they paid. So ideally, your taxing and spending you should have a balanced budget, and everyone involved in government should do everything they can to treat the people's money as holy, because it's holy money, it's charity money, and to economize as much as possible. No bottled water in the Massachusetts state offices. There's a big protest today about bottled water, and then it's the state's job, the government's job, to return the surplus proportionally to each member of the community. But that's another discussion. I have a lot more to say about taxation, but that's the basic topic. So, but the model for the system would be something like Massachusetts, actually. Buy people health insurance that can't afford it, but I think the Talmud feels that if people pay point of service, it keeps costs down and makes for better service. So.
Thank you very much.
Next time.
What is our next topic?
I was actually going to send out an email and get
Okay, good, let me know.
suggestions, and
How
we'll take
come,
it from there.
how come God can allow suffering to happen?
Oh, please. Just read the book of Job, and you'll discover that you know as much as he did.
What?
Yeah.
To
So,
where?
Watertown Street,
Yeah, I think so.
339, I think, Watertown Street. You're reading, yeah. 339 Watertown Street.